So, Jamie, I hear you think it's controversial that you do not like Star Wars. Well, I'm not happy about it, but I have seen a bunch of people asking why The Mandalorian's so bad right now and is Star Wars doomed and all these other little things and you know, I think I have something controversial to say. I like Star Wars. Still. Welcome to Sidetrack, your TV and movie channel.
Harris, it's welcome to Sidetrack, your sci-fi TV and movie channel. Bloody Americans.
So Star Wars is good. It definitely has its moments where it's not perfect, but it's generally good and it's loved for a reason. So let's start with where you started your video off, Jamie. The sequels aren't everyone's cup of tea, mine included. They're not my favorite things in the world, but they generally have some decent concepts, and we'll kind of leave it at that for now, huh? So the prequels are definitely politically oriented, and they are very different than the original trilogy, but they still are fun. Yes, they are that space opera, and they're very operatic and politically inclined, where it's gonna be a little bit slower and you're gonna be more involved with what's going on in the galaxy more so than maybe you're fighting your battles or something like that. So I think the prequels are kind of a perfect example of where Star Wars goes a little bit more into sci-fi. I like them. The OGs are fantastic, and of course I will never say anything otherwise. They're not perfect, but the OG trilogy is fantastic nonetheless. The dialogue is also not perfect, sure, but it's purposeful. And even whenever it's not strictly purposeful, it's more funny, satirical. It's typically funny, satirical, and purposeful nonetheless. I'd even argue to the acting point from your video about Star Wars not wanting to make a good film sometimes. What? Jamie, my friend, what are you talking about? We've got Alec Guinness, we've got Mark Hamill, we've got Carrie Fisher, we've got Harrison Ford, we've got Billy D. Williams, we've got Frank Oz and James Earl Jones voice acting. All of these roles are beloved roles, not just the roles for the actors, but the characters themselves, and that has to do with acting. They're beloved for a reason, and I think they're going to stay beloved. I think the acting in the original trilogies are, once again, purposeful into the way that the stories were written, and we kind of got put into these worlds, and they're not necessarily worlds that we're used to, which changes the way people react to things. And I guess if it's a little more space operatic, a little fantasy like, a little western like, a little samurai like, you know, it's the way that galaxy works, and I for one enjoy it. And Jamie, it's not that George Lucas had little faith in his own film that he didn't go to the premiere and he went on holiday and vacationing with Steven Spielberg. It's that he had little faith in the audience. In the 1970s, of course, the late 1970s, it's kind of weird to have a Star Wars film come out. Nothing really that odd and peculiar had been in cinema yet. Of course, there were some things, Star Trek being one of them, but not necessarily to that degree. And of course, old Lucas paved the way and engineered the way and pioneered it for all of us. But he had little faith in the audiences wanting and accepting something like that at the time. And I think really that's where he went off on holiday with Steven Spielberg. But if we're talking about Steven Spielberg, widely considered one of, if not the greatest director of all time by many, many people, who had faith in Star Wars? Steven Spielberg did. Because Steven Spielberg and George Lucas wagered each other on who would have the more successful sci-fi film. Or space fantasy, of course, in Star Wars. But the more successful sci-fi film in general. It was Close Encounters of the Third Kind, of course, for Steven Spielberg, and George Lucas's Star Wars. Turned into A New Hope later on. Their wager was whoever had the more successful film, the loser, I guess, of the wager technically, or the winner, because they each had faith in each other's films better than they had in their own film, or more so than they had in their own films. The winner would get 2.5% of the proceeds of Star Wars. Suffice to say, Steven Spielberg is a very rich man. So, one of the greatest producers, the guy that made the Goonies, had faith and knew Star Wars was going to be good. That he knew A New Hope was going to be good. George Lucas knew it too. He just had little faith in the audience accepting it at the time. He hoped it would be a cult classic, kind of like American Graffiti was. And THX 11, 1138, 11, whatever his original film was, which I own and I need to watch. But it's amazing the fact that he actually wagered 2.5% of Star Wars. Steven Spielberg was the first director to make $1 billion, by the way. I know I'm sidebarring, but he was the first director to make $1 billion, and a good chunk of that was because of his Star Wars cash. Great. And okay, so I said it a couple times just a second ago, talking about space fantasy, sci-fi, Western. What kind of genre is Star Wars? We can't look at it in that hard sci-fi kind of way we're looking at it, Jay. It's not Star Trek. It's not Stargate. It's not these kind of more specific scientific-based things. Now, it's definitely fantasy-based, but it's primarily based as a story for 12-year-old boys growing up and to have something cool and logical to kind of help them piece the world together. It's not supposed to be super pertinent and scientific, as much as I love those things. This is very much a fantasy, and it is a opera at the same time, but it is a space fantasy first and foremost. So the original trilogy was first and foremost a space fantasy, and that's kind of what Star Wars is as a whole. It's not supposed to be logical per se. It's supposed to be magical and wondrous. It's supposed to be awe-inspiring, and I think it succeeds exceptionally on all those fronts. And yeah, it's not perfect. And, we can go ahead and get into some of those things that aren't perfect, like the sequels. We won't stay long on here because, once again, they're not necessarily my cup of tea all the time either, but they're here. And, the sequels are the sequels. And I know you discussed the fleet on Exegol and how it got built and why there were so many ships way out in the middle of nowhere when the Death Star was there, and did it make the Death Star pointless? And yes, I am kind of roping myself into new canon and kind of explaining away the way they have, but I don't hate the way they've explained it away. I don't necessarily love it, but I don't hate the way they've explained it away. So I guess Disney kind of says that Exegol was the entire giant fleet being built by Palpatine on Exegol was already being built. Vader knew about it, etc., etc. And this is where I guess the potentiality of, we're not positive if this is where it's going to go, but it makes the most sense of Palpatine made that fleet for the Yuuzhan Vong. And if the potentiality of the Yuuzhan Vong coming into the Star Wars galaxy comes true, then this will have made perfect sense, and I will legitimately like it a lot more than the kind of, okay, y'all explain it away, but still like it. So Exegol is there to fight off the Yuuzhan Vong. All this giant fleet is there to fight this giant biohacked kind of non-force race of beings that are trying to come into the Star Wars galaxy and essentially take it over. The Death Star, the second Death Star per se, it kind of was to be, its purpose was more so to enact as the capital for Palpatine. So Palpatine was going to have it to kind of fly around the galaxy and do what he liked. Of course, he could kind of have that threatening giant ray of death to blow up planets, but most of it was just primarily for not necessarily to take over what Coruscant's place was in the galaxy, but to take over what Coruscant's place was in the galaxy. The Death Star was going to be kind of his roving, personal kind of capital. And Exegol was going to be the fleet to kind of back it all up and keep everybody in check, probably. But, of course, primarily be for the Yuuzhan Vong down the road to defend the galaxy. And we'll see where that goes, of course. And, on that topic, if you really delve into Star Wars lore, like you were kind of talking about in your video about not liking it, there really aren't necessarily it's there's no cookie cutter good, bad. Oh, here's an anti-hero, here's an anti-villain, like someone that's going to be redeemed. There's all of those things, and you see that in almost every character in different ways. And you have different points in different characters on where, okay, they could definitely turn more good than they are now or more bad than they are now. And nobody's kind of clearly defined. Even Yoda in the animated series toys with darkness. And he toys with darkness for the sake of like studying it in a way. And it kind of is a beautiful mismatch with Yoda, and you see that, and it's just no stone is left unturned in Star Wars. And part of the beauty of it is the fact that no one's necessarily good, no one's necessarily bad. The Jedi, while trying to do many good things, are kind of religious zealots that are forcing a lot of different worlds to do things that the government that they've allied with want them to do, when a lot of these other people are just trying to live their simple lives without being subjugated by a large body of people that aren't anywhere close to where they are. And that's just the prequels. If you get into the actual original trilogy, it gets a lot more dicey than that, because of course the rebels are terrorist cells by definition, by not just technicalities, by definition they are, for better and worse. Because then you have some Saw Gerrera stuff like you see in Rogue One, like you see in Rebels and the Clone Wars a bunch, and a little bit in Bad Batch. They're not the best kind of rebels. And that's the guy that happened to be in Andor as well. And, we see him and Luthen talk about letting people kind of just die inside the rebellion. These little different sects of rebels just kind of either surviving or dying on a whim. And it's a whim of their friends, a whim of the people they know, and that's not inherently good or bad. Of course, all these actions are for good things. Their purpose is for good in the long run, but in the short run, what kind of shortcuts are you taking? And that's something that every Star Wars project tends to ask, and it's kind of great because of that. It's so much fun. I love asking those questions and continuing to ask them every step of the way makes it feel more human, whether you're following an alien, an actual human, someone that's half human, half alien somewhere. It's really fun. And I think that's one of the core elements of Star Wars, is the fact that there is not necessarily good or bad. And that's where the Force really imbues itself as well. Is the Force good or is the Force bad? We've seen the limits of both sides. We've seen your Yodas, we've seen your Darth Vaders, we've seen your Palpatines, you've seen your Obi-Wans, you've seen your Qui-Gons, you've seen your Ahsokas. And just talking about the Rebel cells and stuff, Jamie, you should definitely watch the Rebel show. And I think not only does the Rebel show and Clone Wars and Bad Batch and things like that, I think not only are they just good wider storytelling for Star Wars that allow you to kind of delve into smaller characters, learn about different worlds and different planets, different species, all kinds of different things. That is where you can really see George Lucas's vision, and it doesn't seem so, this is for the toys, this is for that. And of course, there are definitely decisions that George Lucas and Disney, of course, have made for toy sales. But if you're watching the Star Wars animation, I feel like that's really where Star Wars opens itself up. It's like the bloom of a flower, and it's wonderful. It really is. The stories told by Dave Filoni and George Lucas are masterful, and they're not always perfect right off the go. Sometimes it takes years for you to start loving something. And I guess that's just a patient storyteller doing their things. And yes, George Lucas has always been a patient storyteller. Star Wars has never been the fastest pace of things. But that's one of the reasons I think we love it so much, is because at the end of the day, it takes a little time to get to your destination, but the point of getting to your destination is a lot of the time learning and enjoying things on the journey. And that's what Star Wars is. It's the journey. Star Wars isn't purely sci-fi fantasy. It's not purely a space opera. It's not purely a space western or any of these things. It's a beautiful amalgamation of them all, and it's for the youth, which in turn helps keep the youthful aspect, the kid inside of all of us alive. And I, for one, love it. Thank you, George Lucas and Dave Filoni, for making it. Even if Jamie and all these other internet people are going to dog on it, I'm still with you. I've got my Kyber crystal here. I've got my Star Wars shirt right on me. And I get one in the mail every month. I love my Star Wars. So I'm here for it. No, it's not perfect. Is The Mandalorian a little dicey at the moment? Sure, maybe. Not everything's for everybody. But I'm having a good time with it. It's really making my little Clone Wars and Rebels heart happy. And I hope it does so even more. So come back, check the Patreon out on Sidetrek. Check everything down below in the description for 9 chevrons, the Patreon link. Join the YouTube membership channel here. And have a great day. We'll see you in the next one.